Hello, everyone. It's the Historical Gamer once again, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit of gaming news, something that I used to do more often, but haven't done in a little while. I would like to do more of it, though. I'd like to branch the channel back out into doing things that are more than just sort of chopped up Let's Plays or chopped up live streams, and want to kind of go back, not abandoning any of that. That'll probably still be the core of the show or of the channel, but I would like to do a little bit more variety and sort of have my YouTube channel kind of stand on its own and not just be a repeat of my Twitch channel. But that's beside the point. The footage that you're looking at here in front of you is from a game called Combat Mission Shock Force 2, the newest game in the classic Wargaming franchise Combat Mission, and it's developed by the folks over at Battlefront. This is a series of games that are among the foundational war games in my personal gaming history. And the reason I'm playing Combat Mission Shock Force 2 today is because in a shocking, see what I did there, announcement, a few weeks back, Battlefront announced that they were teaming up with the folks at Slitherine to bring Combat Mission Shock Force 2 to Steam. And it will be launching on Steam on August 25th, so just in a couple of days. Combat Mission Shock Force 2 originally came out, I think, 2 years ago in 2018, and the Battlefront team, which has been releasing Combat Mission games since 2000, has never put a product on Steam. They've been very adamant that they would not put products on Steam, and so this is a major departure for them in bringing this game to the Steam storefront. I know this news was announced a couple of weeks ago, so, there's a fair bit of probability you've already heard about it. But I did want to talk about it because it's a big deal, at least to me anyway, and I think to a lot of wargamers out there. I think what makes it a big deal is I think we have to take a little bit of a look back at sort of the history of the series to understand why this is a big deal. Because there's probably also a fair number of you out there who have never heard of Combat Mission, which is a shame because they historically have been some very good war games. They've looked at modern conflicts, they've looked at World War II, and understanding a little bit of that history and why this is a big deal, I think, is something worth jumping in. So before I talk about the news directly, beyond what we already have, I want to talk a little bit about what Combat Mission is to the wargaming genre and why it's important, at least in my opinion. The first Combat Mission game came out in 2000, the year 2000, and it was called Combat Mission Beyond Overlord. It was a game that focused on the Western Front in France and in Netherlands and Germany from the landings in Normandy in June 1944 until the conclusion of the war in 1945. It was a game that focused on tactical battles and allowed you to fight basically up to like reinforced battalion-size engagements. Units were represented in 3D. Infantry units had sprites on the screen or 3D characters on the screen. I think it was like 3 or 4 men for a squad. So it wasn't a 1-to-1 ratio. Whereas vehicles and tanks were definitely available in 1-to-1 ratios. The game came with like 20 or 30 scenarios, but it had a tremendous editor. And so when the game came out, people immediately started making their own scenarios, and websites would fill up with literally thousands of user-generated scenarios, often of tremendous quality. I remember playing through one that was like a 9 or 10 battle-long story of a unit's campaign in the Cherbourg Peninsula during the Normandy campaign, and it was tremendously done. It was a heck of a lot of fun, and might have been my favorite scenarios, and these were scenarios that were created by someone that you just downloaded it through the internet. Now, when Combat Mission came out in 2000, it was really a watershed moment for the wargaming space on computers. At the time, the games that really dominated the space were the Close Combat series, which I think was in its third iteration by that time. So you had Close Combat 2, A Bridge Too Far, and then Close Combat 3, which focused on the Eastern Front. Those 3 games had all come out prior to this game coming out. And those were games that were much more in the camp of like an RTS game. They were very unique and tremendous games in their own right, but they were sort of top-down 2D looking type battles where you could see the soldiers and you could see the animations and you could see the combat whirling around you, but again, it was all from the top down. There was no like horizontal ground level camera. They had tremendous sound. They had a great design. It was really focused on like morale and the individual soldier. Most of the battles, in my experience, I didn't play the third one, so I think my understanding is they had much larger battles than that. But at least in Combat Mission 2, most of the battles were more of like platoon or company size engagements. You weren't typically looking at battalion size engagements, so it was a little bit smaller scale than close combat. And it had a very interesting and sort of operational campaign layer. I think Combat Mission 2 was the best, where it represented Operation Market Garden and the time crunch there, and the need to take key objectives and hold it for the Allied armor to arrive, so then it could push further inland to support the other units that were cut off. But the Eastern Front also had a similar campaign type system where you'd fight across the Eastern Front on various maps, and you'd come to know the maps and play in them. But that was sort of the primary, one of the primary two war games out at the time. It was the Close Combat series, which again was really focused on the sort of telling the story of tactical battles and like the individual story of the soldiers that you lead, while also being resolved in a real-time way. Very similar to like an RTS type game, but without the base building. More of unit management, less, not really any base building. The other main game that was out around that time was the, I believe it was Steel Panthers, which was a little bit of a different game. This was a turn-based war game that was put out by, I think, SSI originally. I think Matrix Games ended up purchasing the game later on. It was developed by Gary Grigsby, and it was a turn-based war game that allowed you to follow like an individual unit. I think it was like a brigade. You would follow a brigade in World War II. And so you would have a unit that you would take with you from the start of the war or the start of the campaign all the way through to that unit's conclusion of its war. And so you would manage things like ammunition, you would manage things like equipment, replacements, all these other things, while also fighting battles, much larger size battles than the close combat games, in a turn-based map. So, whereas the Close Combat series was real-time, the Steel Panthers series was turn-based. And while the Close Combat series was focused on the individual soldier and the individual engagement, the Steel Panthers series was focused on a campaign that would span the war and would allow you to build connections with your soldiers in a different way and upgrade units and sort of care for units under your command and see them evolve and become completely different than they were at the start of the war. And so it was a bit of a different experience. And when Combat Mission came out, it really broke the mold because it allowed, at least for at the time anyway, it was, good 3D graphics. It was a floor level view, a horizontal view of the combat experience. It wasn't top down, and it merged this idea of turn-based war with real time. And it wasn't the first to do this. This was actually something that TAC Ops from 1994 did as well. But what really made TAC Ops stand out was this merging of 3D graphics of World War II combat with this turn-based issuing of orders and then real-time resolution. So you would go in and you would issue all of your orders. The time would be paused. Nothing would be happening. You'd go to all of your units. You'd select them. You'd tell them what you want them to do. You'd go ahead and hit the play or end turn button. And then what would happen is you would watch those orders be issued and carried out over a 60-second turn. And so you were very clearly merging turn-based warfare with real-time warfare. You were taking the pieces of real-time combat that people loved of Combat Mission, but you were doing it in a way that it didn't feel like an RTS. It didn't feel like you were totally rushed. So you could issue your orders in a more relaxed turn-based setting while also experiencing that visceral satisfaction of watching things unfold in a high-fidelity environment right in front of your eyes. And so Combat Mission merging that WeGo system of turn-based orders mixed with real-time resolution, and then also providing a substantial step up from the Close Combat series in terms of the visual representation of the game into the 3D world, something that Steel Panthers didn't have at all, was really a game changer. And this was a game that at the time they were pretty ahead of a lot of the industry at the time. They actually were somewhat pioneers of digital distribution. They allowed you to purchase the game online, never having to go into a retail store to pick up a box, and then you could just download, or I think you could buy a copy as well, where they would mail it to you. But this was somewhat new. Most games were still in retail at the time, and so they were tremendously successful, so successful that they ended up getting into retail. I remember a couple years after Beyond Overlord came out, I remember seeing it on store shelves years later because it was so popular and so successful. It was a hit game. I don't know if it ever truly got into the mainstream, but for someone who was not at all versed in the wargaming space, and for someone who was playing games like Medal of Honor or other things like that around that time, that was a game that I somehow became aware of. And I remember it being a big deal. I know a lot of wargamers remember it being a big deal, but this goes back to the big deal of the fact that they're coming to Steam, because this is a series that has been constantly releasing new modules, new games over the last 20 years. The series didn't go anywhere, but to a lot of people, they might not have ever heard of it. That's because Close Combat Beyond Overlord came out in 2000. They then released 2 more games, Close Combat Barbarossa to Berlin, which in my opinion is the best of the original 3. I loved the ability to have like pre-planned artillery barrages. That's, I guess, one other thing worth mentioning is one of the ways that the WeGo system worked was when you issued an order to your units, they didn't execute it immediately. In many ways, it's like what you've been watching me see in Grand Tactician. You had to wait for the orders to transmit. You had to wait for the soldiers to follow the orders. And so you might issue an order, but then when you hit play, your units might not actually do anything for 20, 30, 40 seconds or more. The same would be true of artillery bombardments. You could have forward artillery spotters that would be calling an artillery fire, but then you'd have to wait for the fire to arrive. You'd have to wait for them to, to basically communicate with the battery off map in order to begin firing. So, the enemy could move from where you originally called in the artillery before the artillery began to arrive. So it was a tremendous series and a tremendous game, and I think it was very influential for me. I didn't know this until much later, but apparently the series had its origin in like a digital version of Advanced Squad Leader, is kind of where some of the original ideas and development started. I think there might have actually been some partnership with Avalon Hill or something to that effect early on in the game's development, or at least it inspired some of the early on game development. I don't know all of the detailed history. But hey, I read a Wikipedia article once, like a few weeks ago, that mentioned that, so I thought that was kind of interesting. But anyway, going back, so I think that it was really interesting because these first 2 games, Beyond Overlord and then Barbarossa to Berlin, I think, from my recollection anyway, they had a pretty mainstream acceptance of being true classics. And then they came out with Africa Corps, which was the 3rd one, which I don't think was as popular, but I could be wrong on that. I had kind of stopped following it super close by that point. And then they came out with a new engine, and that's when Shock Force 1 came out. It was 2007, so 7 years after the first combat mission came out, they released a new game. It was called Shock Force, and it was on a completely new engine. And this was a game that created a hypothetical conflict between the United States and Syria, and it assumed kind of like a Desert Storm type invasion, or like a Operation Enduring Freedom type invasion of Syria for whatever reason. But again, the idea was we're going to introduce asymmetric warfare against insurgent type forces as well as conventional forces. We're going to set it in the Middle East, which this is 2007 at the time, so it's very topical. The U.S. is still engaged in Iraq. The surge hasn't or is underway at the time that this is going on. It's post the first combat mission game had its origins in the pre 9/11 world, and this was the first game that sort of started introducing those ideas of sort of the post 9/11 world, given it wasn't in World War II anymore. And it was interesting. I think one of the big standouts is there was a big leap forward in terms of graphical tech because it was a completely new engine. I believe this is the period where they went to 1-to-1 resolution of units. So instead of infantry squads being 3 or 4 sprites or 3 or 4 3D characters for a 12-man unit or a 9-man unit, it ended up being 9 men for 9 men. And this is I remember playing this game. It was actually, I believe, at least according to Wikipedia anyway, it was published by Paradox Interactive, which I don't remember it being published by Paradox. I don't even know if I knew who Paradox was in 2007. But even though it was published by them, it was, it was a Paradox of 13 years ago. It was a much more niche publisher and at that time frame. And I remember hearing about it, and I remember buying Shock Force 1 and playing it, but I was somewhat disappointed. I think the main thing I was disappointed is the combat mission games largely, and this goes to their ASL type background, is that it was focused on tactical battles, and so you had literally hundreds of scenarios that people would make. You had dozens of scenarios that would come with the game, and then you had these things called operations. At least this is the original 3 combat missions. And the operations were basically a longer battle. So instead of maybe 30 or 60 turns of a tactical battle, operations would be 30 or 60 turns, and then you'd kind of have a break, and then you'd have a second 30 or 60 turns, or maybe a third 30 or 60 turns. And what it was supposed to represent was a series of battles being fought over the course of a longer period of time. It could be a couple of days, and maybe there's breaks in the combat or whatever. But these were basically the closest thing that Combat Mission had to a campaign in its first three games. There was no dynamic campaign. There was no carryover between battles. You couldn't build the story of a unit in the way that you could in the Close Combat series or the Steel Panthers series. There was no unit. There was a fixed, these are the soldiers you're fighting with this battle, and they're completely different in the next battle. And the only thing that you really had that was close to that was the operational concept, which was kind of cool because the map could expand or contract. I don't know if it contracted, but it could expand over the course of multiple battles. An ammunition supply could become an issue. You'd only get so much resupply. Managing your resources was important. But it never felt like it was anything other than I'm fighting the Battle of Carentan, and maybe it lasts 3 or 4 days, but I'm not going to get to see what happens to the 101st after that. And that was always one thing that felt like it was missing to me. Combat Mission Shock Force 1 did introduce a campaign. It was a series of battles, but it didn't really feel like a living or breathing campaign. There was no dynamism. It was basically just a set of scenarios, and you beat one, and then you moved on, and you fought the next. And so I remember being somewhat disappointed with Shock Force. I think it was also just because, at the time anyway, I wasn't super interested in a U.S. invasion of a Middle Eastern country. I wanted to go back to World War II. The graphics looked so good at the time, and it was a substantial improvement in terms of the overall quality of the game, but for whatever reason, Shock Force 1 just didn't click with me. And then the next game after that was Combat Mission Afghanistan, which was a game that looked at the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. It was made by actually a Russian studio, so it wasn't. I guess it was developed under license, so it wasn't actually made by the Battlefront people. But it was another combat mission game in any event. Apparently, and I never knew this, there was an attempt to make a campaign version of Combat, which would have more of like a true campaign. But that never really got off the ground. Then they came back and did Combat Mission Battle for Normandy, which is probably what I would have wanted Shock Force 1 to be. But by this time, and that came out in 2010, Combat Mission Italy, Fortress Italy, was the next game that I played. And that was, by that point in time, that was 2012. So I basically went from Shock Force 1 to Fortress Italy, so about 5 years between playing, and the only reason I played Fortress Italy was I got a review code to cover it for the Wargamer, and I haven't played Combat Mission since. I've heard of it. I've seen videos from people like Agrippa Maxenius. There are some great videos out there on YouTube, but it's one of those series that if you don't already know they exist, it's hard to find them. And I think the problem is, Combat Mission originally came out when retail was king, when the internet was just starting to begin to distribute games over the internet. Steam wasn't a thing. There was no giant single place that everybody bought their games from. People went out and found games online. They heard about companies, they read articles in magazines, and then they would go to websites and they would learn more about games and more about studios. And there was no there was really no one centralized location where everybody was. And obviously that's changed in the last 20 years. Steam has gone from, what it was in 2007 when Shock Force 1 came out, which was like 10 million users, which was big at the time, but it was not sort of the monopoly of online gaming. And it's gone to become almost, if you're not on Steam, a huge percent of the gaming audience will never hear of you. There are so many people, and I've covered a lot of games before Slitherine and Matrix came to Steam, used to be one of the most common refrains. I would get comments from people who would say, "This game looks really cool. Why can't I find it? How do I've never heard of this game. Where do I find it? How do I buy this game?" Because so many people only ever buy their games on Steam. There's a lot of people who don't buy their games on Steam, but in terms of the percentage of people who are on Steam compared to other avenues, at the end of the day, if you're not on a major distribution platform and someone doesn't follow a YouTuber who covers your game, if you're a developer, you're not on Steam, and your game doesn't get covered, then no one's going to hear of you. People don't just I'm exaggerating here because I'm sure some people do, but the majority of people don't just Google around to try and find new companies, new games, new things like that. And if they don't discover it through like YouTube or Twitch or whatnot, or maybe Twitter or another social media platform, they're probably never going to discover it. And so being on Steam is I think a pretty important thing. Now, I don't have the financials. I don't know the business results. I'm not going to tell Combat Mission or Battlefront what they should be doing in terms of putting their games on Steam. But I do think it was pretty interesting that they are deciding that Combat Mission Shock Force 2, which was released in 2018, they are bringing to Steam after a long time of being out there publicly of saying they're not going to be on Steam. So they used to take a pretty hard line to say, listen, Steam doesn't fit into our business model. And again, I'm not here to judge that. For a long time, Matrix and Slitherine said the same thing until they didn't, and then they went to Steam, and they've obviously had some success there because they haven't come back. Now, some of their games don't go on Steam, but the majority of them do. And so I think that's interesting. I also think it's interesting that Battlefront was also the developer behind Strategic Command, the original Strategic Command series, which I've covered a lot of on the series, not the original series, but the newer ones. They were the original developers on that before eventually Fury Software took over development. But Battlefront sold the rights to the Strategic Command series to Matrix and Slitherine games. So these companies have had a relationship in recent years, and it seems like that series has benefited from getting on Steam and being developed by Fury Software through Matrix and Slitherine. I also thought it was really interesting, the developers of Combat Mission, their official forum posts referenced their partnership with Matrix and Slitherine. It almost, and this is me speculating based off the post that they had, but it almost sounded like perhaps some of this deal came from a desire from the Combat Mission folks to get into the professional wargaming space. And I think they've been in the space before with some of their games in the past, but they made a comment that they really wanted to work with Matrix and Slitherine on like government type professional military simulations or professional uses for Combat Mission, which is I think this is a game that's definitely suited for it. It's, as far as war games go, it's a high fidelity ground combat simulation of tactical warfare. And I think, the desire for them to get into the professional space makes sense because that's where a ton of the money is. But I also wonder how much of Matrix and Slytherine's success with the Command Modern Operations series, having recently signed a deal with DARPA, having agreements with BAE, having agreements with the U.S. military, with the German Air Force, I think it is, and a bunch of other governments all around the world. Matrix in recent years has made big strides in the professional wargaming space, and, who knows? Perhaps Battlefront saw that, and they said, listen, this is where we want to be. Maybe it's an area they've wanted to be for a while and haven't had as much success there, and they said, all right, well, Matrix is having success there. We sold this other title of ours to Matrix, so we have a relationship there. We've worked with them in that sense. Let's get involved. And I think, it's interesting that they're being very clear about wanting to get into the professional gaming space at the same time as they are agreeing to partner with Slitherine and Matrix to publish Combat Mission Shock Force 2 on Steam. So it's not just that they're bringing their games to Steam, but they're bringing their games to Steam with the publisher Slitherine Limited or Slitherine Games. So I think that's a really encouraging sign, and it is interesting because this is something that a lot of folks were complaining about for a while with Battlefront, was not being on Steam. I also think another thing, if all you did was saw the press release, you may have missed that they also made the comment in their forums that this will be the first of their games coming to Steam, but that it will not be the only game coming to Steam. It sounds like they're intending to bring their entire catalog over to Steam over time. They obviously want to launch this one first. They want to see how it goes, and then depending on if it goes well, then they would be bringing the rest of the catalog over to Steam. They also made the comment that, obviously they have the ability to stop that at any time. So if it doesn't work out, if they're not seeing the results they want to see, if whatever their criteria are, if they decide they want to stop the process of moving their games over to Steam, they can obviously do that in their agreement with Slitherine. They're not obligated to bring the games over, so that's probably why they've only announced one game. I'm guessing it's a bit of a test bed to see, like, okay, fine, we're gonna go to Steam and we're gonna see how it goes, and then if it goes well, we'll bring the rest of our catalog over, and if it doesn't, then it won't. I hope that this is the beginning of bringing the whole series over, and I hope that it's very successful, because again, I played a lot of these games when they first came out. I fell away from the series, honestly, to a large part because I just stopped seeing stuff about it. I didn't really follow Battlefront's website. I occasionally would log on and see they were working on different games or doing different things, but like when it's not front and center within like Steam, within Epic, within GOG, if it's not front and center on an executable that you launch literally every time you turn your computer on, it's really easy to miss. They don't run big sales. They aren't part of a big publisher. So, again, unless you were a loyal fan of the Battlefront team, it was very easy to even forget that they existed and that they were still around. Sadly, too, because they really do make some great games. But now they're taking steps to remedy that, because now they're going to be on Steam. They're going to be published by, the preeminent, and no one paid me to say this, but the most well-known wargaming studio, I would say. I mean, Paradox is a bigger strategy studio, but I think the biggest wargaming studio out there is Slitherine Limited, and they're going to be publishing this on Steam. So it'll be, I don't know. I mean, that's kind of just me rambling at this point. The big news is that they're going to be on Steam, and that they never used to be, and they've been developing games for over 20 years, and who knows what's going to come of this, but hopefully it's successful. I'm also hopeful, I mentioned that the first 7 years they released 3 games on the Combat Mission 1 engine, and then the Combat Mission 2 engine started with Shock Force. That engine is now 13 years in the teeth, so hopefully maybe this gives them a big spurt of cash that allows them to maybe modernize their system and develop a new game engine or whatnot, but or maybe just make enhancements to the existing one. I don't know if it needs to be replaced or not, but it definitely is starting to in some extent, show its age. And so I think it could be something that they would benefit from if they had a bit of extra cash to invest in it. And, I think I think they can be successful, because I think if you look at the Graviteam series, Graviteam Maya's Front was huge, at least from an outsider looking in. I don't know how many copies they actually sold, but it really seemed big in the wargaming space anyway on Steam, and seemed to do pretty well. A lot of the videos on YouTube generate a lot of views. Who knows how many they actually sell? But then they made the Graviteam Armored Warfare in North Africa. I forget the name. That might have been the name. It was something different. But that, I think a lot of people play, although not as much as Maya's Front. But Graviteam has obviously had success, right? They're a little bit more of a niche title. I would say the Combat Mission series is kind of similar to Graviteam. I think Graviteam, I believe, I haven't played a ton of it because their user interface is so bad, but they play at a little bit larger scale, and I think they have a larger sort of campaign or operational sense that is built into the games, so that it's not just strictly speaking like tactical battles. So, it is a bit different, but it's also very similar in a lot of ways to the Combat Mission series, and they seem to have had a lot of success on Steam, so we will see how Combat Mission does. But anyway, guys, that's kind of all I got for you. Probably could have cut this video in half, but I hope you did enjoy sort of my musings on this, sort of my own history with Combat Mission, and we'll see what comes up next. But Combat Mission Shock Force 2 is coming to Steam. It is being published by Slitherine, still developed by Battlefront. It is the most recent of the Combat Mission games. It originally came out in 2018. It will be coming to Steam on August 25th. So you'll be able to pick it up from the Steam store on August 25th. And I believe I saw something where it said if you are already a Battlefront customer of this game, where you purchased it directly through them, that you were going to be getting a key, but I'm not sure exactly how that works. It didn't sound like they were totally sure how that was going to work yet either. You know, obviously, if you already own the game, check out the forums to see how to get it on Steam if you're interested in that. But hopefully, this is the beginning of many good things to come. And I'm really curious what you guys think. Is this something you're excited about? Have you been following Combat Mission? Did you know Combat Mission was still around? You know, I don't really know. I think I've got a lot of followers who are really into the wargaming space, so I'm sure they know about it. But I think I also snag a lot of casual or mainstream wargamers who the exposure to their wargaming world may be the likes of Paradox and not much else. So I'm curious to see, you know, of my followers, how many of you fall into the camp of, yeah, this is old news, and, you know, are you kidding me? I already know what Combat Mission is. This is offensive that you even would suggest that someone wouldn't know who they are. Or if this is news to you, and if this is a game that looks interesting to you, and you're excited to see what comes of this. But that's enough of me rambling. Let's go ahead and wrap this thing up. Leave me your thoughts down below. I really do want to hear them. And until next time, this is the Historical Gamer saying once again, thank you very much for watching, and I'm out.